Some women walk into a room and immediately draw attention, not because they are trying to attract attention, not because of striking appearance or social status, and not because they are displaying exceptional communication skills. Yet in a very natural way, their presence carries a quiet magnetism, and that often makes us wonder, what is her secret? Most of us were taught that confidence is something that can be built through communication skills, external image, or learning how to express ourselves more strongly. But Carl Jung believed that confidence is the result of a deeply personal inner journey, a journey of returning to the true self, facing the shadow within, recognizing unconscious wounds that have quietly shaped the way we respond to life, and gradually learning to live from inner coherence rather than from the need to be validated by others. Along this journey, there are 5 essential layers that many women begin to recognize as they return to themselves. Stay with this until the end, because you may discover that this secret has been closer to you than you ever imagined. 1. The ability to distinguish between wounds and the true self. One of the biggest changes in the journey of inner growth does not come from becoming stronger, but from beginning to recognize that not every emotion you feel reflects the truth of the present moment. Some emotions are echoes from very distant times in the past, times when you had to learn how to adapt in order to be accepted, to be loved, or simply to remain inside a relationship when you were not yet ready to choose differently. When a woman begins to recognize this, she does more than understand herself better. She begins to step into a new field of awareness where her true self is no longer confused with reactions shaped by old wounds. In Carl Jung's analytical psychology, these reactions that seem perfectly reasonable are often guided by psychological complexes, clusters of emotional memory that have not yet been fully integrated into consciousness. Complexes are not mistakes. They were once ways your mind protected you, but when they remain unrecognized, they can turn an unanswered message into a sign of abandonment, a small comment into a denial of your worth, or a temporary distance into a fear of permanent disconnection. In moments like these, your reaction does not truly belong to the present. It belongs to a part of the past that is still trying to be seen. Complexes are like characters living inside the personal unconscious. They do not disappear simply because you grow older. They become quiet only when they are recognized. When they remain unseen, they begin speaking on your behalf. They shape how you interpret silence. They shape how much you trust yourself. They even shape how you love. That is why inner maturity does not begin by removing complexes, but by learning to recognize when you are living from them and when you are living from yourself. One of Jung's central insights shows that what remains unconscious continues to shape our lives in quiet but powerful ways. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Perhaps the reason you sometimes feel forgotten is not that you truly are forgotten. Perhaps the reason you sometimes doubt yourself is not that you lack ability. Perhaps the reason you sometimes seek reassurance is not that you are weak. Perhaps these are simply unconscious parts of you still trying to protect an older version of yourself. The story of Naomi, a friend of mine, is a very clear example of how reactions that seem small in the present can actually be guided by much deeper emotional memories inside. Naomi lived for years with the feeling that she had to respond immediately whenever someone texted her. If someone close to her did not reply within a few hours, she began to feel a subtle tension in her body, like a warning signal she could not quite name. She often told herself it was simply because she cared about people, but deep inside, there was a part of her that believed silence meant she was no longer important. What is important to notice is that Naomi was not lacking confidence in the way people usually imagine. She had a stable career, close friendships, and long-term relationships. Yet something in her always reacted faster than the present moment itself. When Naomi began learning about Jungian psychology, she realized her reactions did not belong to the present. They belonged to a complex formed very early in childhood, when silence once truly meant distance. At that time, she did not yet have the capacity to understand that silence could simply mean someone else was tired or living at a different rhythm. She had learned to interpret silence as danger, and that interpretation stayed with her for years, without her realizing it. The turning point did not come when Naomi tried to become stronger. It came when she began asking a different question. Does this reaction belong to the present or to the past? That question did not make her emotions disappear immediately, but it created a small space between her and her reaction. And inside that space, a different kind of confidence began to emerge. Not the confidence that others would always stay, but the confidence that she could remain with herself even when others were silent. In Jung's language, this is the moment when part of the self begins returning to the center, not by removing complexes, but by placing them in their rightful place within the story of her life. When that happens, a woman no longer needs to react as quickly as before. Not because she becomes colder, but because she begins to understand that not every emotional signal needs to be trusted immediately. Some signals simply need to be listened to and then gently set down. Truly confident women are rarely women without wounds. They are usually women who have lived long enough to recognize that their wounds are not their identity. They do not deny their emotions, but they do not allow emotions to decide the entire story either. They learn to distinguish between reactions from the past and the truth of the present. And this distinction completely changes the way they live. From that distinction, they begin to understand something very important. The past may leave traces, but it does not have the authority to define who they are today.
Nothing you can do about it. Some of you have had divorces. Some of you have probably had bankruptcies. Some of you have had terrible things happen in the past. But what's gone is gone. It's in the past. Let's not look back in anger. Let's quit thinking in reverse, nor forward in fear, but around us in awareness.
When a woman no longer confuses complexes with her true self, she no longer needs constant reassurance from the outside world. Not because she no longer needs connection, but because she no longer needs a connection to prove her worth. When she stops reacting to old fears, she begins to hear her inner voice more clearly. And when she no longer needs others to choose her to feel meaningful, she begins choosing herself in a very natural way. This change often happens quietly. Everything is still there, but the way she sees it has changed. Silence no longer means abandonment. Comments no longer mean rejection. Distance no longer means disconnection. And within this subtle shift, a new kind of freedom begins to appear. If Naomi's story helped you recognize something of yourself, share your story in the comments. Your experience may help another woman realize she is not walking through this alone. 2. Inner confidence. In modern society, confidence is often understood as the ability to express oneself strongly in front of others. The familiar image of a confident woman is often associated with speaking clearly in a meeting, making quick decisions, maintaining a steady presence in high-pressure situations, or walking into a crowded space without seeming uncomfortable. Those expressions are not wrong. But if we look through the deeper lens of Carl Jung's analytical psychology, they still do not touch the core of inner confidence. Jung did not see confidence as a social skill, but as a psychological state that appears when a person begins to accept all of who she is, including the parts that are not yet perfect, not yet fully understood, and sometimes even parts she herself has avoided for years. In Jung's approach, real confidence is not built by eliminating weakness. It is formed when a person dares to return and face the shadow, the parts pushed into the dark region of consciousness, because they do not fit the image we think we need to become. The shadow does not contain only negative things. It also holds emotions that were never expressed, needs that were never acknowledged, boundaries that were never set, and even capacities that were overlooked because the environment did not encourage them. When the shadow is neglected for too long, the outer ego often has to work harder to maintain a stable image. And the longer that image must be maintained, the more easily a woman begins to feel tired without understanding why. An immature ego often tries to maintain a perfect image because it believes that image is the condition for being accepted. It needs to prove that it is good enough. It needs to control how others see it. It needs positive feedback to feel safe. That is why even a small comment can shake it. Not because the woman herself is weak, but because the image she is protecting is too fragile to withstand a change in how others see her. When the ego has to rely on image in order to exist, it remains on guard all the time. And when it has been on guard for too long, it becomes exhausted. By contrast, when a woman begins the journey of individuation in the way Jung described, she slowly realizes that real confidence does not come from maintaining a stable image in the eyes of others. It comes from seeing herself more honestly, not only seeing the strong part, but also the vulnerable part. Not only seeing the rational part, but also the emotional part. Not only seeing what she has done well, but also seeing what she once tried to hide. This kind of seeing does not make her weaker. It makes her more real. One very important idea in Jung's thought shows that people do not become whole by becoming perfect, but by becoming more conscious of what already exists within them. In a reflection on psychological development, Jung expressed this in a sentence that is very simple and yet very deep. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That sentence is often understood as a reminder that inner light does not come from trying to become better according to outer standards, but from daring to look at the parts of ourselves we once avoided. When a woman begins to do this, she no longer needs to maintain a perfect image. And when she no longer has to maintain that image, the energy once used to protect it begins to become energy for presence. When I think about the difference between a confident appearance on the outside and true feelings on the inside, I am reminded of Jane's story. Jane was the kind of woman most people trusted whenever a quick decision had to be made or someone needed to hold steady in an important moment. The people around her often described her as confident. But in the evenings, after returning home from a long day, Jane often felt a kind of exhaustion that was hard to name. Not tired from work itself, but tired from having to hold a stable image for too long. She began to realize that most of her energy during the day was not being used to solve problems, but to make sure she was always appearing in the way people expected. Jane's change began in a very small moment when she realized that she was always trying not to let others see her confused. Not because confusion was something bad, but because very early in life, she had learned that confusion made other people lose trust. When she recognized this, Jane did not immediately change her behavior, but she began to ask herself a new question. Was the certainty she was showing actually an inner certainty, or was it simply a layer of protection formed a very long time ago? When Jane became familiar with Jung's ideas about the shadow, she began to realize that the confusion she had tried to hide was not a weakness to be eliminated. It was a part of herself that needed to be seen. The first time she allowed herself to say, "I need a moment to think about this," in an important meeting, nothing negative happened the way she had imagined. No one lost trust in her. No one thought less of her. The only thing that changed was that something inside her felt a little lighter. And from that lightness, a new kind of confidence began to appear. From a Jungian perspective, that moment was not merely a behavioral shift. It was a sign that the shadow had begun to be integrated into consciousness. When the shadow is no longer pushed out, the persona no longer has to work excessively to maintain a stable image. And when the persona no longer has to work excessively, the self has more space to appear. It is within that space that inner confidence begins to form. Inner confidence is not the feeling of always being certain about everything. It is the feeling that you do not need to pretend to be certain when you are not. It is not about always appearing strong. It is about no longer needing to hide your fragility. It is not about being seen correctly by others. It is about seeing yourself a little more clearly each day. When a woman no longer has to perform, she begins to show up in a very different way. She does not need to speak more in order to be noticed. She does not need to prove more in order to be respected. She does not need to maintain a stable image in order to feel valuable. Her presence becomes deeper because it is no longer built from the effort of holding up an image. It is built from inner honesty. Other people may not notice this change right away, but the woman herself feels it very clearly, just as Jane began to notice that she no longer had to prepare so many answers before entering a difficult conversation, not because she no longer cared about the outcome, but because she was beginning to trust that she could remain with herself even if the outcome was imperfect. And that trust created a kind of calm she had never experienced before. Inner confidence is like taking off a suit of armor you have worn for so long that you forgot how heavy it was. While the armor is still on, you think it is protecting you. But once you remove it, you realize your body has been tired for a very long time. And in that still moment without the armor, you begin to feel your own breathing again in a way that is deeply real. If you have ever recognized yourself in Jane, strong in the eyes of others but sometimes exhausted from holding that image for too long, then the next part may be very important for you. In part 3, we will go deeper into a subtle ability that many women lose without even realizing it, the ability to trust the voice within. Keep watching, because sometimes restoring that small inner connection is enough to change the way you walk through your own life. 3. Trusting yourself. Migratory birds do not have the ability to read maps as they fly across the ocean, and yet every year they still find their way back to the same familiar shore. No one teaches them each direction of the wind. No one stands at the horizon to confirm that they are moving along the right path. They rely only on a very deep sensing within their bodies, a form of orientation that is quiet but steady. Many grown women begin to realize that their inner life once had a capacity like this as well. They may not always have had words for it, but there was a time when they could feel where to go, where to stop, what to say, and when to remain silent. And over time, that sensing grew smaller as they learned to adapt more to the expectations of others than to the voice within themselves. One of the clearest signs of real confidence is not found in how a person speaks to the world, but in how she listens to herself when no one is watching. This is something many women begin to recognize only after long years of living responsibly, kindly, and reliably, while slowly losing touch with what they themselves truly wanted. They become accustomed to asking others for input before trusting their own feelings. They review their decisions again and again, even when the answer is already present inside. They wait for confirmation from the outside before acting, not because they lack the ability to think independently, but because they have learned that safety comes more easily through agreement than through honesty with themselves. In Carl Jung's analytical psychology, this experience is not understood as weakness, but as a sign that the inner center of orientation has shifted away from the self and towards structures formed for adaptation to the environment. When this happens, a person may still live very effectively. She may still make reasonable decisions, but she often carries a quiet sense that she is walking through a life that is correct, yet not entirely her own. Jung did not see intuition as merely a supporting mental function. He saw it as one of the most important pathways back to the self, because intuition allows a person to recognize what the mind has not yet articulated, but the inner life has already felt. When a woman loses connection with her true self, the first thing that often disappears is not her ability to think, but her trust in her own deeper sensing. And when intuition is no longer listened to, a person begins to live according to expectations rather than according to inner truth. She becomes more skilled at adapting, but at the same time, she becomes slightly more distant from herself. This distance does not appear in a single day. It gathers slowly through many small decisions in which the inner voice is set aside after the voices of others. Within the depth of Jung's thought, returning to intuition is not an impulsive or careless act. It is an essential step in the process of individuation, where a person gradually shifts the center of orientation from outer approval to inner awareness. In a reflection on this journey, Jung expressed very clearly that true clarity appears only when a person dares to turn inward toward her own inner life. Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. There is something very gentle and powerful in this sentence, because it does not ask a woman to become different immediately. It simply opens the possibility that the clarity she has been searching for may not come from gathering more advice from the outside, but from returning to something she has known for a very long time, yet has not fully allowed herself to trust. And in that moment, self-trust begins to return. Trust in oneself begins with very small choices that often no one else notices except the woman who is making them. Each time she keeps a promise to herself, instead of postponing what she knows matters, she places a small stone into the foundation of confidence. Each time she respects her own feeling instead of ignoring it in order to maintain harmony, she restores a part of her inner authority that had once been scattered. And each time she pauses long enough to ask what she truly wants, instead of asking only what seems most reasonable, she creates new space for the self to appear. Marie Curie offers a clear example of this journey. In the scientific world of early 20th century Europe, for a woman to pursue research in physics was not an easy choice, not because of a lack of intelligence, but because the surrounding environment was not accustomed to seeing a woman stand at the center of a major scientific field. When Curie chose to continue her research into radioactivity, even though it meant working in difficult conditions with limited equipment and almost no protection for her health, she did not rely on social approval to know she was moving in the right direction. She relied on a very deep sense of the value of the work she was pursuing. From a Jungian perspective, Curie's journey reflects an essential quality of self-trust. It is not absolute certainty about outcomes. It is loyalty to an inner sense of meaning. Curie could not have known in advance that her work would change the history of science. But she knew that continuing her research was true for her, and that loyalty to her inner knowing created a form of confidence that did not depend on immediate recognition from the outside world. In the process of individuation described by Jung, moments like these often mark the shift of the center of consciousness from the persona to the self. The persona helps a person adapt to society, but if the persona becomes the only source of direction, she loses contact with the deeper part of herself. When the self begins to be heard again, decisions are no longer based only on what is most accepted, but on what is most true. And this shift creates the foundation of trust in oneself. Truly confident women are rarely women who feel certain about every choice. They still have moments of hesitation. They still have days when they need more time to understand what they are experiencing. But there is one subtle difference. They no longer hand over the authority to define their lives to other people. They listen to advice without losing their inner voice. They consider possibilities without abandoning their intuition. And step by step, the relationship between them and themselves becomes clearer. Trust in oneself, therefore, is not a state in which doubt disappears. It is the ability to continue walking even while doubt is still present. It is the ability to remain connected to the inner voice even when the outer world has not yet responded clearly. It is the ability to recognize that intuition cannot always be explained immediately by reason, and yet still deserves respect. In the next part, we will look more closely at how truly confident women learn to protect their inner space while still remaining connected to others. Stay with this journey, because sometimes restoring a boundary at the right moment is enough to help you begin returning closer to yourself again. 4. Protecting personal boundaries. A garden without a fence does not become more open. It simply becomes easier to walk across without anyone noticing. The flowers still bloom, but they bloom in a space where any footsteps can pass through without permission. Many women have lived this way for years without fully realizing what was happening inside them. They remained kind, responsible, and fully present in their relationships. From the outside, everything seemed fine, but deep inside, there was a quiet feeling that others may have valued them more for their willingness to give than for who they truly were. And then at some point, when they begin to recognize this, a very important change slowly starts to appear. That shift is enough for them to begin seeing themselves differently and to stand more firmly within their own lives. One of the clearest changes that happens when a woman begins to trust herself is that she stops allowing others to define her limits. This is not rigidity. It is not coldness. It is a subtle shift in how she understands her responsibility toward her own inner life. Many women were taught from a very early age that disappointing others should be avoided, not because they were weak, but because they were loved when they were easy to be with. They were accepted when they were flexible. They were trusted when they were willing to adapt. Over time, they learned to say yes when they meant no. They learned to endure discomfort in order to preserve harmony. They learned to make themselves smaller in order to keep relationships. And step by step, they became accustomed to placing the needs of others before their own inner experience. Within the depth of Carl Jung's analytical psychology, this pattern is not understood merely as a social habit. It is seen as a sign that the persona has become the center of orientation instead of the self. The persona helps a person adapt to the world. It helps us know how to behave appropriately within different roles. But when the persona becomes the only way a woman relates to the world, she begins to lose the ability to recognize where her true boundaries are. And when true boundaries are no longer clear, the relationship between her and herself quietly begins to weaken. Jung did not see personal boundaries as a tool for creating distance from others, but as an expression of honesty with one's inner life. When a person allows the outer world to enter her psychological space without genuine consent, what happens is not harmony. What happens is division. One part of the woman remains inside the relationship, but another part of her begins to withdraw from herself. And when this happens repeatedly over time, she may continue maintaining stable relationships while still feeling that she is slowly disappearing inside her own life. A profound idea within Jung's thought expresses this very clearly. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This sentence is often understood as an invitation toward personal growth, but in the context of inner boundaries, it carries a more specific meaning. Becoming yourself is not an abstract state. It is a series of very practical choices, where a woman begins to realize that she does not have to sacrifice honesty with herself in order to preserve stability in her relationships. And each time she protects that honesty, even in a small situation, she is moving closer again to herself. Many people only recognize this after years of living inside relationships where they were always the ones maintaining harmony. They listened more than they spoke. They yielded more than they held their ground. They adjusted more than they revealed themselves. They did not do this because they had no needs of their own. They did it because they believed the stability of the relationship depended on their ability to adapt. But over time, they began to feel tired, not because they stopped caring about others, but because they began to realize they no longer had enough space left to care for themselves. A woman I once met during a psychological training program shared that she had always been the person her family called whenever something needed to be resolved. She became used to arranging her time around the needs of others. She became used to listening to everyone's stories without ever speaking about her own. For many years, she believed this was an expression of responsibility and love, but at some point, she began to notice that each time she said yes, while her body was already tired, a part of her became a little quieter. Her change began with a very simple sentence one evening when she received a familiar call asking for immediate help. For the first time, she said she needed more time before she could help. No one left her after that. No relationship ended. The only thing that changed was that something inside her became clearer. She realized that setting a boundary did not make her selfish. It helped her become more genuinely present within her relationships. From a Jungian perspective, that moment is very important. It marks the shift from living through the persona to living closer to the self. When a woman begins to set boundaries, she is not separating herself from the world. She is creating a space where her relationship with herself can be protected, and that relationship becomes the foundation of all other healthy relationships. Confident women understand that boundaries are not distance between themselves and others. Boundaries are protection for the relationship between themselves and themselves. So they begin with small changes. They say no earlier. They explain less. They leave environments that drain them sooner than before, not because they become colder, but because they begin respecting themselves in a way they had not allowed before. This process rarely unfolds perfectly. There are days when they still feel guilty for setting limits. There are moments when they still want to return to old patterns because they feel familiar. But each time they protect their boundaries a little more, they strengthen their relationship with themselves. And that relationship creates a kind of confidence that no longer needs to be proven to anyone. Protecting personal boundaries is like rebuilding the fence around a garden you have cared for over many years. The fence is not built to keep people out. It is built to make sure that anyone who enters does so with respect. And within that protected space, the deepest parts of a woman finally feel safe enough to continue growing. What many women slowly begin to discover through this process is that protecting their boundaries does not weaken their relationships. It strengthens their relationship with themselves. And when that inner connection becomes clearer, something changes, quietly but deeply. They no longer need to give more than they truly have in order to feel valued. They no longer need to hold every situation together in order to feel secure. Instead, they begin to stand in their lives with a steadiness that comes from honesty rather than effort. And from that steadiness, a quieter and more natural form of confidence begins to grow. If you have stayed with this journey until now, you may already be beginning to recognize something familiar in your own story. But the final part that comes next is the most important one, because it is where everything we have explored begins to come together into a real inner shift. 5. True presence. First, I want to tell you about Eleanor, because as you listen to her story, you may recognize something very familiar within yourself, something you may have felt for a long time, but never quite named. Elena was the kind of person who, when she walked into a room, somehow made everything feel calmer. Not because she tried to impress anyone, not because she spoke a lot, but because she always knew how to keep the atmosphere steady. She knew when to stay quiet so others could speak. She knew when to adjust her emotions so conversations would not become tense. She knew when to soften in order to keep a relationship from falling apart. Many people thought this was confidence, but Elena knew that was not entirely true. What they were seeing was her ability to adapt, not her true presence. For many years, Elena became used to showing up in the way others needed her to be. At work, she kept her voice steady enough not to be overlooked, but gentle enough not to be seen as difficult. In her family, she was the one who held the emotional rhythm so things would not go too far. In friendships, she listened more than she spoke. No one asked her to do these things, but she had learned very early that if she could keep stability for others, she would remain in their lives. And over time, she became very good at that role. So good that she no longer noticed she was slowly moving away from herself. One evening after a long day, Eleanor told a close friend that what made her most tired was not her work. What made her tired was the feeling that she always had to be the right way in every interaction. She said she was present in many conversations, but rarely felt that she was truly there. The sentence sounded simple, but for Elena, it was the first time she admitted that she no longer knew what real presence felt like. What is interesting is that Eleanor's change did not begin with a major decision. It began with a very small moment during a familiar gathering. That day, she did not try to hold the rhythm of the conversation. She did not try to adjust other people's emotions. She simply sat there, listened, and spoke when she truly wanted to speak. Nothing special happened. No one reacted differently. But when she returned home, she noticed something unusual. For the first time in many years, she did not feel as if she had been playing a role. When a woman begins to build inner trust, to distinguish between reactions that come from old wounds and those that come from true intuition, to stop performing strength and to establish personal boundaries, something very natural begins to appear. Not a new skill, not a new image, but a new state. That state is presence. In Carl Jung's analytical psychology, this state of presence is not a social quality. It is the result of the process of individuation, when the ego no longer needs to constantly adjust itself in order to control how it is seen by the world. A person begins to live from her true center. And when that happens, presence is no longer something that needs to be constructed. It becomes something that naturally appears when a person no longer leaves herself in order to adapt to the world. True presence does not need to attract attention, yet others feel it very clearly. Not through reasoning, but through sensing. It creates a space of safety in which others no longer feel the need to defend themselves as much as before. It creates a sense of authenticity without requiring explanation. And perhaps most importantly, when someone is present in this way, the people around her begin to feel that they too can stop performing. This is the deepest form of confidence a person can develop, not the confidence that comes from knowing what to say in every situation, but the confidence that comes from no longer needing to become someone else in order to be accepted. In the process of individuation that Jung described, true presence appears when the self begins to become the center of psychological life rather than the persona. The persona still exists. It still helps us communicate with the world, but it no longer determines how we exist within the world. When that shift happens, a woman no longer needs to ask herself how she should appear in each situation. She simply appears as herself. Eleanor began to recognize this change not through dramatic events, but through small moments. She noticed she no longer had to prepare every possible response in her mind before entering a difficult conversation. She noticed she no longer needed to review how she had appeared after each interaction. She noticed she no longer had to keep the emotional balance for everyone in a room. These changes did not make her more noticeable, but they made her more real. True presence is like a lighthouse standing quietly in the middle of the night sea. It does not chase the ships. It does not try to call them closer. It simply stands where it belongs and shines in its most natural way. And because it stands in its right place, the ships passing nearby are able to recognize their direction more clearly. A woman who is truly present is like that. She does not need to lead others. Yet her presence helps others feel that they too can return closer to themselves. That is why true presence is not something that can be learned through technique. It is the result of returning to the self. When a woman no longer needs to control her image, the energy once used to maintain that image becomes energy for presence. And when that energy returns to its natural place, confidence is no longer something that must be built. It becomes something that appears. What Elena gradually discovered is something many women begin to recognize only after years of quietly adapting to the needs around them. True presence does not come from learning how to manage every situation perfectly, or from becoming stronger in the eyes of others. It begins the moment a woman stops adjusting herself in order to remain accepted and starts returning to the steady center within her. From there, confidence no longer feels like something she has to maintain. It becomes something she naturally carries. And often, this shift begins in very small moments. The moments when she allows herself, perhaps for the first time in a long while, to simply be there as she truly is. When a woman begins to live closer to that center, her presence is no longer an effort. It becomes the natural state of not leaving herself in order to enter the world. And within that state, the deepest form of confidence begins to appear in a quiet but unmistakable way. The secret of a truly confident woman lies in the moment she stops searching for her worth in the eyes of the world and begins returning to herself in a more honest way. She learns to listen to her inner voice instead of quickly doubting her own feelings. She learns to recognize the reactions that come from old wounds instead of allowing them to define her present. She rebuilds trust in herself through small but consistent choices. She protects her personal boundaries, not to distance herself from others, but to remain connected with herself. And from that place, a very natural presence begins to emerge, one that does not require effort and yet can be clearly felt. The journey of becoming oneself is always the most difficult journey, yet it is also the most necessary one, because a person only becomes truly strong when she no longer has to divide herself into an outer self that seeks acceptance and an inner self that silently endures. A truly confident woman is not someone without darkness. She is someone who has walked through that darkness without losing connection with her soul. When that happens, she no longer needs to chase confidence. She becomes someone whose steadiness can be felt even before she speaks. If you recognize yourself somewhere in this journey, leave a comment with the phrase "I'm confident" as a gentle reminder to yourself that you are returning to who you truly are. And if this video touched something within you, consider liking it, sharing it with another woman who may need to hear this today, subscribing to the channel, and continuing to walk with us through deeper inner journeys in the videos ahead.